pregnant black woman fed every orphan until a wealthy rancher saw her and she stood at the edge of the world, or what passed for it in this dust-choked corner of the territory, a place where the sun didn't so much shine as it did beat down, punishing the cracked earth and the souls foolish enough to walk on it. Her name, she'd told folks, was Sarah, but the name felt like a borrowed coat, something to keep the worst of the chill off. The truth of her was in the swell of her belly, a promise of life in a land that mostly dealt in endings, and in the circle of children that clung to her skirt. They weren't hers by blood, but they were hers by a different kind of bond, the kind forged in shared hunger and the silent understanding of being left behind. Every day it was the same ritual, the dust, the heat, the gnawing emptiness in the bellies of the little ones. They were the town's ghosts, the children of miners lost to cave-ins, of mothers lost to fever, of fathers who just up and vanished. The town saw them, but it didn't look. It was easier that way. But she looked. She couldn't not look. Her own hunger was a dull ache, a familiar companion, but theirs was a sharp crying thing that echoed in the hollow space inside her own ribs. So she did what she could. She begged scraps from the saloon's back door, gleaned fallen potatoes from the edges of fields, and once she'd spent her last 2 bits on a bag of flour, making a thin, tasteless bread over a fire of scavenged twigs. The smoke stung her eyes. The sweat traced paths through the grime on her face. Her back screamed from the weight of the baby, a constant grinding pain that radiated from her spine. But when a small, calloused hand took the piece of bread she offered, the gratitude in those wide, hollow eyes was a balm. It didn't fill her stomach, but it mended something else, something deeper. The silence of the town was the worst part. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, it was a loud, deliberate ignoring. The clink of glasses from the saloon, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the rustle of a silk dress on the boardwalk, all sounds that built a wall around her and the children. They were an ugly truth the town didn't want to acknowledge. A pregnant woman of color, trailed by a half-dozen ragged orphans, was a stain on their rugged, pioneering pride. She knew it. She felt their gazes slide right past her, as if she were made of glass, of air. There was no pity, no anger, no disappointment, just a profound and terrifying nothing. She'd talk to the kids in a low voice, a murmur against the wind, telling them stories of a green place, a place with a river that ran clean and trees that gave shade without asking for anything in return. It was a lie, a fairy tale she spun from the thread of her own desperate hope. Her hands were raw, her knuckles split from scrubbing clothes in the creek for a few pennies, her feet swollen and bare. The act of giving, of feeding them from her own emptiness, was the only thing that made her feel solid. It was an anchor in a sea of indifference. She was a mother before her own child was even born, a shepherd to a lost flock on the precipice of oblivion, and she did it all under that hateful, unrelenting sun, with the dust coating her tongue and the silence of the world pressing in on all sides, a weight almost as heavy as the child she carried. This story is just getting started, and I've got to ask, where are you all watching from tonight? Let me know in the comments down below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And hey, if you're already feeling this one, do me a solid and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. It really does help keep these stories coming. Now let's get back to it. His name was Silas, and he wasn't a man given to noticing things. He'd trained himself out of it. Noticing led to caring, and caring led to a hurt he'd sworn he'd never feel again. He rode into town once a month for supplies: salt, flour, coffee, ammunition. He spoke only when necessary, his voice a low gravel that seemed to cost him something to use. He'd get his things, nod at the storekeep and be gone, melting back into the hills where his ranch sat like a hermit's keep, surrounded by acres of silence and stone. But this time, he saw her. He couldn't not see her. She was a disruption in the town's harsh, predictable rhythm. He was tying his horse to the rail in front of the general store when he caught the scene out of the corner of his eye. The woman, heavy with child, breaking a small loaf of what looked like miserable, gritty bread into 6 even smaller pieces. The children, all eyes and bony wrists, taking their share with a solemnity that belonged in a church, not a dusty street corner. He saw the way her back was bowed, the exhaustion carved into her face. He saw the other townsfolk, the good church-going people, walk around the little group as if they were a puddle of muddy water. He stood there for a long moment, a sack of grain slung over his shoulder, just watching. He wasn't a good man. He knew that. Goodness had been burned out of him along with everything else he'd once held dear. But what he was seeing wasn't about goodness. It was about something more fundamental. It was wrong. The wrongness of it was a physical thing, like a stone in his boot. He finished his business, his movements stiff, his face set like granite. He bought his usual supplies, and then he stopped. He looked at the sacks of flour, the slabs of bacon, the dried beans. Without a word to the clerk, he pointed. A whole sack of flour, a side of bacon, a large bag of beans. He paid in coin, the metal clinking loudly in the quiet store. He didn't take the supplies to his horse. He carried them, the flour sack a heavy white burden on his shoulder, and walked across the street. He didn't go to her. He went to the abandoned lean-to behind the livery stable, the place he'd seen the children huddled the night before, trying to escape the wind. He set the supplies down in the dirt, the flour sack, the bacon wrapped in butcher paper, the beans. He didn't leave a note, he didn't say a word. He just left them there, a blunt, unspoken statement. Then he turned, walked back to his horse, and rode out of town without a backward glance. He didn't want thanks. He didn't want connection. He just wanted the stone out of his boot. She found the supplies the next morning. The sun was barely a pink smear on the horizon when she led the children to their makeshift shelter. She saw the white of the flour sack first. She stopped dead. Her heart, which usually beat a slow, tired rhythm, gave a painful lurch. It had to be a mistake, a delivery left in the wrong place, or worse, a trap, a cruel joke. She approached it slowly, her hand resting on her belly. The children hung back, sensing her fear. But when she saw the slab of bacon and the heavy bag of pinto beans, she knew. This wasn't a mistake. This was for them. She didn't know who. She didn't know why. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sharp, but she blinked them back. Crying was a luxury. Instead, a fierce, protective energy surged through her. She had to get this somewhere safe. She enlisted the older children, and together they half-dragged, half-carried the bounty away from the town, to a small, hidden cove by the creek. That night, for the first time in months, they had a real meal. She made a thick stew with beans and chunks of salty bacon, cooked in an old pot she'd found. The smell alone was a miracle. The children ate in silence, not their usual solemn silence, but a reverent one. They ate until their bellies were full. Then they ate a little more. She watched them, a piece of flatbread cooked on a hot rock in her hand, and felt a crack in the hard shell she'd built around her heart. Later that week, he came back. He didn't ride into town. He rode along the creek, checking his fence lines. He saw the smoke from her small fire. He found her washing clothes in the water, the children splashing nearby. He just sat on his horse on the opposite bank, watching. She looked up and saw him. A big man on a dark horse, a silhouette against the harsh sky. Fear shot through her, cold and quick. But then she recognized the set of his shoulders, the hard line of his jaw. She didn't know his name, but she knew who he was. He was the flour, the beans, the bacon. She stood up slowly, wiping her wet hands on her dress. They just looked at each other across the moving water. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned his horse and rode away. The next day, he came back. This time he dismounted and crossed the creek, the water soaking the bottom of his trousers. He didn't say hello. He just looked at her, then at her swollen feet. "You can't stay out here," he said. It wasn't a question or an offer. It was a statement of fact. "There's a cabin on my land. It's empty." She just stared at him. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. "Winter's coming." That was all. He led the way, and she, gathering the children, followed. The cabin was little more than a one-room shack, but it had 4 solid walls and a roof that looked like it might hold. He left her there with a stack of firewood and an old bucket. That night he returned with a lantern and a pot of stew. They ate on opposite sides of the small room, the silence broken only by the sound of spoons scraping against the tin bowls. He saw a gash on her arm, scraped and dirty from her fall a few days prior. He motioned for her to come closer. He poured a little of his whiskey onto a rag and cleaned the wound without a word of comfort. The sting was sharp, but his touch was steady. It wasn't kind. It was necessary. And in that small, rough cabin, surrounded by a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with a shared, unspoken purpose, trust began to lay its first, shallow roots. They lived in the silence for weeks. The days fell into a rhythm dictated by necessity. He would work the ranch. She would tend to the cabin and the children. He'd leave a rabbit or a brace of quail on the porch step. She'd leave a plate of hot food for him when he came in from the cold. Words were scarce, like water in a dry season. They didn't need them. The language they spoke was one of action, of mended fences and mended clothes, of firewood stacked high and a pot of water always kept warm on the hearth. But the past is a ghost that doesn't need a door to get in. Lives in the quiet moments, in the space between heartbeats. One night, a storm was raging outside, the wind howling like a hungry wolf. The children were asleep, huddled together under a pile of blankets he'd brought down from the main house. She was staring into the fire, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot water. The flames threw dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. He liked storms, she said, her voice so low he almost didn't hear it over the wind. He looked at her, waiting. He knew she wasn't talking about one of the children. My husband, Jacob. She spoke the name like an old prayer. He said it was God's own anger, washing the world clean. He was a good man, worked on the railroad line laying track. Strong hands, always smelled of steel and sweat. She took a slow sip of water, her eyes never leaving the fire. He got a cough, just a little one at first. Then it got in his chest. The company doctor gave him some syrup, said he'd be fine. He wasn't fine. It took him in a month. I held his hand while he left. He told me to go west, said there was opportunity. He made me promise. She fell silent, the story hanging in the air between them. It wasn't a plea for pity. It was just a statement, a recounting of facts, the facts that had led her here to his cabin with another man's child in her belly. Silas didn't say anything for a long time. He just poked the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. He understood stories that ended in the ground. He knew the weight of a promise made to the dying. "See that hill," he finally said, his voice rough. He gestured with the poker toward the window, toward the darkness outside. "The one with the 2 lone pines on it?" She nodded. "My wife, Martha, is buried up there, and my boy, Daniel. He was 6. The words came out blunt, chipped from stone. Fever came through, took half the valley. There was nothing to do. I held them both. Burned the house they died in. Right after. Couldn't stand the smell of the sickness, the memory of it. Built this place with my own hands." He looked at his hands then, big and calloused, as if seeing them for the first time. "Some things you don't get over. You just carry 'em." They sat there, the storm raging outside, the fire crackling inside. 2 people from different worlds sharing the same silence. A silence now filled with the ghosts of a railroad man named Jacob, and a woman named Martha, and a little boy named Daniel. It wasn't comfort. It was a shared wound. A rough-hewn understanding that the world breaks everyone, just in different places. The first snow came early, not a gentle dusting, but a sudden, violent blizzard that swept down from the mountains without warning. It was a physical assault, wind that cut like a razor, snow so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Silas was out on the range, trying to push a handful of stray cattle back toward the shelter of the valley. He'd misjudged the sky. A bad mistake. The world went white. No landmarks, no sun, just the roaring wind and the biting cold. He was in trouble, he knew it. Back at the cabin, she knew it too. She saw the storm boil over the ridge, a solid wall of white fury. He wasn't back. The hours ticked by. The cabin grew colder. The wind clawed at the walls. The children were scared, their eyes wide in the flickering lantern light. She couldn't just wait. Waiting was a kind of death. She pulled on the heavy coat he'd given her. She wrapped a rope around her waist, tying the other end to the porch railing. A lifeline. She took the lantern. "Stay inside. Don't open the door," she told the oldest child, a boy of 10 named Sam. Then she stepped out into it. It was like stepping into a roaring beast. The wind stole her breath. The snow blinded her. She couldn't see. She could only feel her way, one hand on the rope, the other holding the lantern out in front of her like a useless prayer. She started yelling his name. "Silas." The wind ripped the name from her lips and tore it to shreds. It was hopeless. It was stupid. But she kept going. Out on the range, he was losing. His horse was stumbling, exhausted. The cold was a deep, creeping thing, sinking into his bones. He was starting to get drowsy, a dangerous sign. And then he heard it. Faint, almost imagined. A voice. His name. It couldn't be. But he heard it again. A beacon in the white chaos. He turned his horse toward the sound. He pushed forward, his last reserves of strength fueled by that impossible voice. He saw a light, a tiny bobbing speck of gold in the swirling maelstrom. It was her. He couldn't believe it. She was out in this. For him. When he finally reached her, he practically fell off his horse. He was covered in ice, his face raw. She grabbed his arm, her small frame surprisingly strong. No words, no time. Together they followed the rope back. A slow, agonizing journey. They stumbled into the cabin, bringing the storm in with them, and slammed the door shut against the howling world. They had survived. Together. A raw, survivalist unity born in the heart of the blizzard. The storm locked them in for 3 days. The world outside was gone, buried under a thick blanket of white. Inside the small cabin, a new world was taking shape. The shared brush with death had changed the air between them. The silence was different now. It was no longer a space to be filled with ghosts, but a space of shared existence. A quiet pact. He spent most of the time by the fire, recovering. The cold had settled deep in his joints, and his leg, the one kicked by the horse weeks ago, ached with a vengeance. She tended to him without a word. She kept the fire roaring. She made a hot broth, forcing him to drink it. She rubbed a pungent salve she made from pine resin and grease onto his aching leg, her touch firm and practical. One afternoon he was trying to mend a piece of tack, his fingers stiff and clumsy from the cold. The leather needle slipped, piercing the flesh of his thumb. He cursed, a low, guttural sound. Before he could react, she was there. She took his hand in hers. Her hands were smaller, but steady. She pulled the needle out with a quick, clean motion, then pressed a cloth against the wound to stop the bleeding. He looked down at their hands. His, large, scarred, and weathered like old wood. Hers, delicate but strong, holding his without tremble. He didn't pull away. He just watched as she cleaned the cut and wrapped it tightly with a strip of clean linen. It was a gesture of immense intimacy, performed with the detached efficiency of a field medic. He was a man built of stone, a fortress of his own making. But this woman, with her quiet strength and her unwavering gaze, was like the persistent water that finds the cracks in stone, not with force, but with patience. She was becoming a part of his landscape. Later, one of the younger children, a little girl named Mary, woke from a nightmare, crying out. Before she could even get up, he was there. He didn't say anything. He just sat on the edge of the small cot and laid a heavy hand on the child's back. A solid, grounding weight. He just sat there until her sobs quieted, and she drifted back to sleep. She watched him from across the room. This man, who had walled himself off from the world, was letting the world back in, one small, unconscious gesture at a time. The bond between them wasn't spoken. It was built in the shared space of survival. It was in the way he stood between her and the cold. It was in the way she tended to his wounds. It was the rhythm of their breathing in the quiet cabin, a silent promise to protect, to endure. It was a partnership as raw and real as the wilderness that surrounded them, a fire they tended together against the encroaching dark. When the snow finally melted enough for the pass to be cleared, the town re-emerged, and with it, the gossip. News traveled fast in a place that small, and the story of the pregnant black woman and her brood of orphans living out at the hermit Silas's ranch was too juicy to ignore. It started in the general store, as these things always do. A couple of ranchers' wives bundled in wool, their voices low and sharp. "Did you hear?" one said, pretending to inspect a bolt of calico. He took her in, all of them, out at his place. The other woman, a Mrs. Gable with a face like a clenched fist, sniffed. "It's a disgrace. A man like that with his history and her, well, you see the color of her. And with a belly full of who knows whose child. What's he thinking?" "He ain't thinking," A man leaning on the counter chimed in, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. A man gets lonely out in them hills. And a woman's a woman, I reckon. Even one like that. The laughter was coarse and ugly. The words spread. To the saloon. To the church steps after Sunday service. They twisted the story, shaping it into something sordid and mean. She was a witch who had him under a spell. She was a harlot using her body to secure a roof over her head. The children were just bait. The narrative was simple, ugly, and easy for them to swallow. It protected their own inaction. If she was a bad woman, then they were right to have ignored her. If he was a fool, then his charity was nothing to be admired. Silas felt the change the next time he went to town. The nods he usually got were gone, replaced by stares. Some curious, some hostile. Whispers that stopped when he got too close. He ignored it. He walked with his head held high, his face a mask of indifference. He went to the store, bought twice the supplies he normally would. Flour, sugar, a length of warm flannel, a bag of peppermint sticks for the children. He paid the clerk, who refused to meet his eye. As he was leaving, Mr. Gable, the woman's husband and one of the town's more self-important figures, stood in his way. "Silas," he said, his tone dripping with false concern. "Folks are talking about the situation out at your place. It ain't right. It ain't decent." Silas just looked at him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't get angry. He simply shifted the heavy sacks in his arms and stepped around the man as if he were a piece of furniture. A quiet, powerful dismissal. He walked out of the store, leaving Gable standing there with his mouth open, and the rest of the town watching. His action was louder than any argument. He had chosen his side. He was no longer just a resident of the hills. He was the protector of the cabin, and everyone in it. And the town, with its narrow heart and poisoned tongue, could damn well stay on the other side of the fence. The confrontation he'd been avoiding was inevitable. It came on a Sunday. She had walked into town with two of the older children to see if the preacher, a man who spoke of charity every week, might have some old clothes for them. She knew it was a long shot, but she had to try. They were standing outside the church, waiting for the service to end, when the preacher himself, Reverend Miller, came out. He saw her, and his face, usually arranged in a mask of pious benevolence, tightened. He wasn't alone. Mr. Gable and a few other of the town's leading men were with him. "Woman," the preacher began, his voice carrying across the quiet street. There was no ma'am or miss, just woman. "We cannot have you loitering here. You are a distraction. And your living situation is a stain on the moral character of this community." She felt a cold dread seep into her bones. She pulled the children closer. "Reverend, I was only hoping for a little charity. Some outgrown clothes for the children. Charity is for the deserving," Gable sneered, stepping forward. "Not for vagrants and worse. You're living in sin out there with that man. Everyone knows it. You're a blight." He was close now, his face red, spittle flying from his lips. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "You need to take your brood and move on. We don't want your kind here." Time seemed to slow down. The shock on her face, the fear in the children's eyes, the self-righteous anger on Gable's. And then, a shadow fell over them. Silas. He'd followed her to town, a feeling of unease nagging at him. He moved with a speed that was terrifying in a man his size. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He simply took hold of Gable's wrist. It wasn't a violent grab. It was a calm, deliberate closing of his hand. Gable's face went white. He tried to pull away, but it was like being caught in a blacksmith's vice. Silas's eyes weren't angry. They were cold, as cold and hard as the winter stone on his land. "Let her go," he said. The words were quiet, but they cut through the air like a blade. Each word was a nail hammered into a coffin. Gable, his bravado evaporating in the face of this calm, immense pressure, released her arm instantly. Silas held his gaze for a second longer, a silent promise of what would happen if he ever touched her again. Then he released Gable's wrist. He turned to her, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Come on," he said, his voice back to its usual gravelly tone. "We're going home." He placed a hand on the small of her back, a simple, protective gesture that was a declaration to the entire town. He had crossed a line. The man who never got involved, who hid from the world, had just stood up in the middle of town and physically defended her. He had broken his own vow of isolation, and in doing so, had bound himself to her in a way that was now undeniable in public. The ride back to the cabin was silent, but it was a thick, charged silence, heavy with the aftermath of the confrontation. The children, sensing the tension, were quiet. When they got back, she put the children to bed, her movements automatic. Silas stood by the window, staring out at the darkening landscape, his back to her. The wall he had kept between them, the wall of gruff necessity, had been shattered back there in town. He had stepped out from behind it, and now neither of them knew how to act. She finally finished her tasks and came to stand near the hearth. The fire was the only sound in the room. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. He didn't turn around. "Yes, I did." His voice was flat. "They shouldn't have put their hands on you. They think," she started, then stopped. "They think all sorts of things. It don't matter what they think." He finally turned to face her. His eyes, which she had always seen as hard and distant, were filled with a raw, unguarded emotion she couldn't name. It looked like pain. "What matters," he said, his voice low, "is what's true." She held his gaze. This man had given her shelter. He had fed her and the children. He had faced down a storm for her, and now he had faced down a town for her. He had offered her more decency and protection than she had known in years, all without asking for a single thing in return. He deserved the truth, all of it. "My name," she said, the words feeling strange and momentous on her tongue. "It ain't Sarah." He waited, his expression unchanging, giving her the space to offer this piece of herself. "My name is Elodie." The name settled in the quiet room. It felt real, solid. It was the name her mother had given her, the name her Jacob had whispered in the dark. It was her. "Jacob," she continued, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "He didn't just die of a cough. He was working a dangerous line. The company knew it. There was a rock slide. They said it was an accident, but it wasn't. They were cutting corners. He wasn't the only one. They gave me a little money, told me to be quiet and go away. I came west because he asked me to, but I was also running. I was scared I don't know. I just ran." The whole story tumbled out, plain and unadorned. Not a performance, just the simple, ugly truth. When she was finished, the silence returned, but it was a new kind of silence, a silence of acceptance. He walked over to her, stopping just a few feet away. "Elodie," he said. He tried the name out, his rough voice softening around the edges. It sounded like it belonged there, in that cabin. It sounded like home. He nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture. "I reckon that's a good, strong name." In that moment, by giving him her true name and her true story, she had given him the last piece of her trust. And he, by receiving it with such simple, solemn gravity, had shown her it was safe in his hands. The days that followed felt different, lighter. The spring thaw had come in earnest, and the land, brown and frozen for so long, was beginning to show hints of green. The air smelled of damp earth and new life. Silas had changed. A subtle shift, but a profound one. The hard lines around his eyes seemed to have softened. He spoke more. Not much, but enough. He asked Elodie about the baby. He taught Sam how to whittle a piece of wood into a rough-looking bird. He had claimed them, not with words, but with action, and in doing so had started to reclaim himself. One morning, Elodie woke to the sound of him working outside, near the cabin. She went to the door and saw him clearing a small, square patch of ground. He was digging out the rocks and turning the soil with a shovel, his movement steady and purposeful. The earth was dark and rich. He worked for hours, preparing the small plot of land as if it were the most important task in the world. She watched him from the doorway, her hand resting on the high, hard curve of her belly. When he was done, he straightened up, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. He saw her watching and motioned for her to come out. She walked over to him, the soft ground yielding under her feet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled paper packet. He unfolded it carefully and poured the contents into her palm. Seeds. Small, dark, and full of promise. Mostly vegetable seeds, corn, squash, beans. But mixed in were a few tiny, almost invisible flower seeds. "For you," he said. "For the cabin. So you can have a garden." She looked down at the seeds in her hand, then up at him. It wasn't just a garden. It was a statement. Gardens were for people who planned to stay. Gardens were for people who had a future. He had cleared the rocks. He had tilled the soil. But he was letting her do the planting. He was giving her the power to put down roots. In his land. With him. She knelt, the movement awkward with the weight of her child, and picked up a single corn seed. She pressed it into the dark, welcoming earth. A seed of belonging. A promise of a harvest. A quiet, defiant act of hope in a world that had offered her so little of it. She was no longer just a survivor, running from the past. She was a planter, sowing a future in the stubborn, fertile ground of a reluctant savior's heart. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like and subscribe for more tales just like this one.